It is a great joy to welcome everybody here. I think I should start and say good evening to all of us on the East Coast, both in the United States and Canada. Good afternoon to everybody in the other parts of the continent, and ohayo gozaimasu to everybody in Japan. My name is Yuko Handa, and I'm the Executive Director for the Japan Society of Boston. Today's program is especially exciting, not only because we will be talking about Hayao Miyazaki, who is obviously long acknowledged Japan's preeminent animator and director, but also because our interest in anime have brought together audiences from not only the United States, Canada, Japan, but also Colombia. So everybody welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are cross generations too. Among us are high schoolers who belong to anime clubs, college students who are studying Japanese, business professionals, anime specialists, and a whole lot of people who grew up watching anime and still do. So share with us in chat where you are right now so we can all see where we are joining this program from. This program is the first of our new speaker series at the Japan Society of Boston. It's called the Japan's Pop Culture Takeover, which is co-sponsored by the Consul General of Japan in Boston. Before I introduce our speakers of the night and her conversation partner, I would like to ask Consul General Omori for a few words.
Hello, folks. I'm very excited to announce that the Consul General of Japan in Boston, with the Japan Society of Boston, will host a remote event named Japan's Pop Culture Takeover Speaker Series that starts tonight. Over the next 2 years, the series will invite pop culture experts from Boston or any other areas for dialogue, presentation, or anything about pop culture of Japan. The events are expected to showcase how anime, manga, or any other forms of modern Japanese pop culture have developed, how they are accepted, and how they have an impact on society of Japan or any other parts of the world. Tonight, I welcome Professor Susan Napier of Tufts University and Professor Ian Condry of MIT for being the host of the dialogue. The dialogue tonight will be based upon Susan's work titled Miyazakiworld. Mr. Miyazaki Hayao is, with no doubt, one of the most prominent creators of Japanese anime. His most well-known work, Spirited Away, was awarded Oscar in 2003. By the way, do you remember who was the presenter on that stage? It was Cameron Diaz. Setting aside the trivia, from their dialogue, I'm looking forward to being enlightened with their interpretations and insights about the deep layer of meaning that runs beneath the series of director Miyazaki's works. That should be something I have never been heard of. Must be a thrilling night. Let's enjoy the dialogue together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Consul General Omori. He is with us tonight, but we decided to tape it just so that we don't lose his welcome. So thank you, Consul General Omori. As you all know, our speaker tonight is Susan Napier. She is Goldwaite Professor of Rhetoric at Tufts University. Susan is author to many books and articles on anime, besides Miyazakiworld, which she will be talking about tonight. But she is also known for her writing on Mishima Yukio and Oe Kenzaburo. We have a lot to thank Susan for, as she is, I really feel that she was really important in positioning Japanese anime, not just as basic cartoons aimed at entertaining younger audience, but through her academic work, she has shown many how to dig deeper and watch more consciously, because only then will anime provide profound food for thought, sometimes philosophical, and sometimes emotionally wrenching, but definitely enriching. And in conversation with Susan tonight is Ian Condry, another Japan specialist I respect deeply. Ian is a cultural anthropologist, professor in comparative media studies and writing at MIT. His book, Soul of Anime, offers a model for understanding how media and culture are changing in the 21st century. Ian is also one of my favorite Japanese hip hop radio DJ, whose program I often use as actually background music when I'm working, because I tell you, it is hot and cool. And it really gives me the energy to actually work when I'm feeling like I don't want to work. So I hope after the show, you will also, after this program, you will also hear him on he's on WMBR 88.1 FM Cambridge and online at WMBR.org. And the program is called Near and Far. So let's get excited to hear Susan take on who Miyazaki Hayao is and what his influences mean. And let's look forward to the conversation between Ian and Susan, because I have a feeling it is going to have some probing questions. We will be accepting Q&A, so please keep sending questions in chat. But while Susan and Ian is in conversation, I am going to ask all of you to turn your microphones off and your video off so that we can all concentrate on Susan's presentation and the conversation with Ian afterwards. So without further ado, Susan.
Okay, thank you very much, Yuko-san, for that really wonderful and rather touching, moving introduction. And speaking of wonderful and moving, I really want to thank the Japan Society for inviting me tonight and all of you for coming. I have a very fond feeling about the Japan Society of Boston. As you may or may not know, it's the first Japan Society in America, which is cool in itself. I also have to admit that I was born and raised in Boston, and really got my interest in Japan started at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which I know has had a long association with Japan Society as well. So thank you. Another wonderful thing about being here tonight is just to be here. I mean, it's been a long, pretty terrible year, almost exactly a year, isn't it? Yeah, and you know, it's just great to have a chance to sort of see familiar faces and new faces, and look forward to hearing your discussion and your questions towards the end of this. And I think it's been a time that we've sort of had a chance to kind of think about what things are important to us, what we want to do with the rest of our lives. And I at least have found Miyazaki's works to be very inspiring in that regard, because they contain moments of such beauty and wonder and hope. And yes, even sometimes redemption, which is something that is worth thinking about in after a difficult year. Another thing about Miyazaki, and I'm going to, in a minute, switch to a share screen, but he's also very prescient. I think I talk about his beauty and his lights and the radiance of his films, but there's also a side to Miyazaki that really recognizes the darkness. And again, this year, I really appreciated that side as well. Miyazaki does not always go for the easy, happy ending or for, the kind of fairy tale moment. And I thought about this particularly this year. I was thinking a lot about his early film, Kaze no Tani no Nausicaa, or Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, which is also a manga. And it was created in 1984. And it's a brilliant movie. I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. But it's set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where humanity has managed to almost completely wipe itself out. There are still a few warring human factions left, inevitably. But they're dealing not only with each other, but also with nature, and specifically a toxic miasma that has kind of covered most of the world. And in order to go out into that world, they have to wear masks. And when I first saw the movie of Nausicaa, I thought, Oh, weird masks. How do you ever get that idea? And then this year I'm thinking, oh God, welcome to 2020. Go, go Miyazaki for once again being a good forecaster. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. I thought what I'd do today is to talk a little bit about the making of Miyazakiworld, my book, and then talk more about the specific aspects of Miyazaki that I think are really important. I talked about the sparks that fly from it because that's, as I was saying earlier, that's the thing about Miyazaki is that there's so much that comes out of his work. There's so many things that he deals with, the environment, gender issues, apocalypse, even kind of a lot of children's questions. I mean, he's a very, very sparkling artist with so much going on. So writing a book about him actually was quite an effort. But I wanted to really try to encapsulate who he was and how he communicates with the rest of the world and what he's communicating. And I will say when I wrote the book, or originally wrote the prospectus for the book, I went to Yale and I sent it to them. And the person who became my editor said, "Oh, this is nice." I'd actually done mainly a kind of film study sort of thing, going film after film. But she said, we kind of kicked around the proposal for a while. And, we were wondering, maybe you could write it more as a biography of Miyazaki. And I thought, holy cow, biography. I mean, that's so much more work. And I'm going to have to look up all these interviews in Japanese and read all these different things that I, hadn't planned to read. And oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And of course I said to her, great idea, biography. Yes. And so this is how it started. How do you write a biography about a living person? And not just a living person, but a living Japanese person who is almost like a living national treasure? Very carefully. I think this is not just true of Japan, but Japan is a society which guards people's privacy very carefully. There's very little gossip on Miyazaki. There's very little biographies of Miyazaki. I really had to kind of figure out a lot of things, partly from looking at his movies and seeing things in his movies that clearly related to his own life, but also to kind of try and weave my way around the sort of Ghibli structure and their kind of issues of control and trying to control the Ghibli brand and Miyazaki brand. And as I said, try to do it very carefully. When I started out the book, it was Ghibli was still part of Disney. And so that added another exciting thing because Disney is also very into control. So again, I had to be sort of careful about what I was saying and thinking about Disney is now no longer in charge of Ghibli, by the way. That agreement ended. So things may be a little bit more liberal now. But you also have to deal with the people at Ghibli itself. This is a poster from a documentary about them called the Kingdom of Dreams and Madness. It's a great title. And you'll see, of course, here's Miyazaki. And this very important person, Toshio Suzuki, is a producer. And then we have Isao Takahata, who is was a brilliant kind of directing partner with Miyazaki for many years until his death a couple of years ago. But all these people have a very strong stake in how Miyazaki is presented. And so I did get a chance to interview Miyazaki, and I talk about a little bit in my book, but it was a very careful interview. And I found really more kind of usefulness in terms of his reading interviews between him and other people, and also reminiscences from Suzuki-san. And I know that Ian has actually met Suzuki and interviewed him, so I'm really looking forward to hearing about that later on in the presentation today. And this is a picture of Suzuki looking very disarming and sweet, but I gather he's quite a character and someone who is a very tough behind the scenes presence. And as I said, also very, very willing to talk and share anecdotes, which is very helpful. Another person whose work I found very helpful was a man named Yoichi Shibuya, who's actually a rock critic. But there are 2 volumes of kind of interviews between Miyazaki and Shibuya, in which Miyazaki really lets his hair down. And it was very interesting reading this stuff because they talk about a wide variety of subjects, and Shibuya is not scared of Miyazaki. A lot of people are kind of scared of him because he's so important. But Shibuya would kind of press on him at certain points, and that was very interesting. They did use a lot of colloquial Japanese, which was, again, kind of exciting for me to deal with. But I think I learned a lot, as I say. One last person I might mention is Tokiko Kato, a singer. Some of you might know her or her voice as the voice of Gina in Porco Rosso. And Tokiko Kato did a very interesting interview, a sort of discussion between Miyazaki and her. And again, very sort of open and bring up some very interesting things. Miyazaki talks about war guilt and his own issues with sort of trying to expiate his feelings of guilt about Japan. It's a very open, letting his hair down interview. So these were the kind of things I used to sort of figure out how I could approach Miyazaki. One more aspect of Power Control, of course, is his staff. And when I started writing the book and had my interview with Miyazaki, he had just retired. Remember when he retired? Yeah, it was very quick, but I happened to hit it just time. He'd retired, they'd gotten rid of Ghibli. And so I got a chance to talk to a number of his staff, went out drinking with them, met them for lunch, and that was very useful too. So I really owe I owe thanks to them as well. As I said, it was an interesting period to be talking to them. So why should you care about Miyazaki? Obviously, it's, I've written a book about him, so I care. Lots of possibilities. The bottom line, Ghibli is a big deal. It's a big deal studio with very high earnings, more and more over the last 10 years. It's now on a streaming service with HBO Max. And it is, what's really wonderful is it's very, very internationally known. This is not just a studio that's popular in America and Japan, it's popular around the world. And I'm going to brag horribly for 1 minute and just say that as of last week, my book, Miyazakiworld, has 10 translations, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, French, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, and Czech. Oh yeah, and here's the Japanese one, and here's the French one. So I'm not just doing this to brag horribly, which of course I am, but also just to say this is a real worldwide phenomenon, Miyazaki and his studio. Okay, other reasons to be interested in Miyazaki, cute things, naturally. The iconic Totoro, who has lightened the lives of many people since he appeared in the 1980s. And over the years, Ghibli has gotten more into merchandising. For a while, they were sort of like, no, we don't do that. But that is part of the Ghibli brand these days. And it is soon to be a theme park coming in 2022. And I have very mixed feelings about this. It's going to be a big theme park with all kinds of fun things. I worry a little bit about, again, sort of diluting the brand, but it probably will be a lot of fun, and I would like to go, I have to admit. Okay, really, why are we interested in Miyazaki? This may surprise you. I could easily say, and I will, that Miyazaki is a great artist, a world builder, a really extraordinary creator, an auteur, but also, I want to talk a little bit kind of from a wider, pull back a little bit and say that he's important because he's part of a phenomenon that started in the 1980s, which was this grassroots phenomenon of interest in Japan and Japanese culture among young people largely, people who were sort of early adopters of the internet, who got into anime and really, really found something in anime and many of them in Miyazaki that was not available in popular culture. And I mention this because I know that Ian is also interested in very strongly in kind of global grassroots kind of culture, because this this was a very exciting moment. This was not something that was pushed by Sony or the Japanese government. This really was a grassroots, people kind of telling each other about, wow, there's this really interesting Japanese stuff. You should find out about it. And why did they like it so much? Some of my interviewees over the years have said the characters seem more real than those in US media, animated or not, which I think is very interesting because you think of animation as inherently unreal. But unlike Hollywood, the characters in anime and in Miyazaki in particular are complex, interesting characters who are very rich. You can even have a pig or a man with the face of a pig be a very complex and fascinating character. Also, and I think this is one reason why Miyazaki is particularly good, maybe in these difficult times we've been having, because sometimes the good guys lose. It doesn't always end perfectly happily. And I think this is something that young Americans and other people around the world were beginning to realize, that Hollywood just didn't always do it for them, because the world is a more complicated place than happy endings. And finally, of course, the other main reason is that he's a great world builder who creates marvelous, immersive worlds that are very distinctive. I call him an auteur. We don't usually think of animators as auteurs because they're seen as working with so many other people and creating a product. But Miyazaki puts his stamp on practically every frame, every cell of the film, and he does the storyboards, which are the screenplay. He chooses the music, works with the composer, chooses the music. He writes the theme songs. I always joke that he would sing the theme songs if he could, and he chooses the voice actors, and he's very, very much in control. So very quickly, I do talk in my book a lot about what is Miyazaki's world. And I mean by that, not just the world he creates, but what were the worlds that created him. And I do talk quite a lot about the traumatic history, the traumatic world that he grew up in, which starts in Tokyo in 1941 with the beginning of World War II. And he actually lived, and he was 4 years old during the terrible fire bombings of Tokyo in March 1945, and went through the American occupation and has also lived through Japan's tremendous double-digit growth, followed by the so-called bubble period, and then followed by the recession. So he has dealt with a great deal of traumatic moments in his life, and they have come out one way or the other as a kind of, I think, psychic working through in his movies. The bombing of Utsunomiya, you'll see, is then reworked in Howl's Moving Castle. His mother was tubercular and bedridden for 9 years of his youth. We see another vision of tubercular mother in his beautiful movie Totoro. And also the Japan-US security treaty protests, which were in the early 60s, that were very important in making him a real strong believer in kind of left-wing ideals. And he does have a political agenda that is carefully promulgated, but it is certainly part of this, the world that he grew up in. And again, there's Porco Rosso, and who is a person who is turned into a pig because he'd rather not be a fascist. He'd rather not wage war. And so we see this sort of pacifistic left-wing side to Miyazaki very clearly coming out of his own life. Then we have the bubble period where everything was great. Japan was riding high, money, hedonistic lifestyle, which we see a little bit echoed in his charming fantasy Kiki's Delivery Service in the mid-1980s. Then things get more difficult with the recession. The government tries to spend its way out of recession and basically pours concrete all over Japan. And Miyazaki at one point said, I just felt like I was living in a sea of concrete. And this comes through in his beautiful work, Spirited Away, in which we see two, not just one, but two rivers that have been polluted and in one case dammed up by construction. And Spirited Away is many, many things, but I don't mean to say it's just about that, but this environmental side is also very clear. And recently in Howl's Moving Castle and also in Ponyo, his second to last movie, he's dealing with the graying of Japan, the fact that Japan's society is getting older and the birth rate is much lower. And finally, I just want to mention that he's consistently worked on gender and really shown a very, very kind of remarkably progressive view of gender for his period, starting in 1980s with Nausicaa. And I believe that has a lot to do with his mother, who was a very strong, bright, forthright woman. And so we see all these different aspects coming into the creation of Miyazakiworld. And I finally would just like to say, because I know we want to move on, I do think of Miyazaki and Miyazakiworld as an alternative to Disney. And by that, I mean not just in different kinds of animation, different stories, but also a different worldview. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having two different worldviews to deal with. In fact, I'm going to be giving a course next fall at Tufts on, I'm can't decide whether to call it Disney or Ghibli, but I'm comparing Disney and Ghibli because I think it's important that for so many years we've had this very strong American worldview through popular culture. And then, you know, from the 1980s on, there's been this new worldview that has been not just Miyazaki, but it's been spearheaded by the incredible popularity of Miyazaki's and Studio Ghibli's work. And it's kind of exciting to be living in a world where we can get in touch with different worldviews through the medium of popular culture. And just an example of, as I said, Miyazaki is willing to kind of deal with sort of darker, more complex aspects of the world than perhaps Disney is. And again, I think it's one reason why he is becoming more and more popular. And so I wanted to end with just sort of quotation about creativity, because I think it stems from so many different places, and we can talk more about that in Q&A. But this is from someone who's writing about world literature, but I really want to talk about world art. So I would say insofar as literature and art are globally transportable, but also changeable institutions, they cannot be understood exclusively in terms of political power and domination, but also as an enabling alternative to other domains of power. Because I really feel like Ghibli is, and Miyazaki in particular, is offering us an entry, a door, an opening door into another way of looking and approaching the world that may allow us some a chance to escape, at least for a little while, the captivity of our own world. So thank you, and happy to go on to Ian.
All right, well, that was lovely, Susan. Thank you so much. And yeah, what a fabulous book and a fabulous portrait of an amazing person. Just great. I did want to follow up on one of the things you mentioned. I'm very curious to hear what you learned from the staff of Studio Ghibli.
That is interesting. Yeah, well, I try to be delicate. I mean, this was a time when not all of them were like really pro Miyazaki. And just to understand, this is really important to give the context. You know, actually Miyazaki had talked for years about retiring. It's sort of like something he does. It's his thing every 3 or 4 years. I can't take it anymore. We need new blood here. I'm getting out. But this time he said he really meant it. And they really closed down the studio. I mean, it was, when I went to interview him that spring, I mean, the studio was kind of dead. I went to he has a little atelier next door. And for some people, there was a sense of, well, what are we going to do? We still need our jobs. And he had been by the way, very generous. This is really important. He had his animators on contract, which is not typical at all of most anime studios, which are much more kind of hand to mouth. And he even had a little a kind of hokuiken, a sort of daycare center for the staff's children. So he had been very kind. And then all of a sudden, everything's gone. And so, people were still very loyal to him, but, some of them did talk about the incredible amount of work they put in for Ghibli and for Miyazaki in particular. And I remember one man who shall be nameless talking about Princess Mononoke. And that really, I think that was one of the movies that kind of really took it out of a lot of people. I mean, they were just mortgaging their lives for months and months to get that movie done. And it's a masterpiece movie, but there was some bitterness and some people just left after that. So yeah, I'd love to go back today and talk to them now, because of course Miyazaki is now busy at a new film. But that was kind of a little bit of a low time for Ghibli.
So you're saying that he said he was a tyrant?
I'm not saying that. Okay, I would bet that, let's see, he's a brilliant director who's in charge of pretty much everything. He's a perfectionist. He is really, he's incredibly detail oriented. I would imagine working for him would be an intense process.
Right. Disciplining, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating, just fascinating. And did you get any sense of whether they thought of Takahata differently? This is a question that came up in the chat.
Oh, what a great question. I don't know. Darn, I wish I'd asked them that. Certainly from what I've read and heard Miyazaki say about Takahata, he is very much someone who is also seen as a perfectionist. I mean, even worse, even more than Miyazaki. And I know Takahata drove Miyazaki crazy and Suzuki crazy because his beautiful masterpiece film, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. The Tailor Princess Kaguya cost $50 million to make. It was the most expensive film ever made in Japan. And it still hasn't recouped its expenditures. And it also took 2 extra years. And so, yeah, I think the great thing about Studio Ghibli is it is such a kind of homey, a hands-on studio. The tough thing about Studio Ghibli is it's a homey, hands-on studio where you have really 2 major talents and kind of working it out. So, yeah, it's
fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, well, I have very little experience with Studio Ghibli. I tried to do some field work there, but years before I started my anime research, I had a chance to go and meet Toshio Suzuki, the producer, the famed producer of Studio Ghibli. And I think you're right. Your description of him as disarming and sweet is exactly how he comes across.
Yeah.
Mild-mannered, but likely also a tyrant behind the scenes. But he gave a fascinating portrait of Studio Ghibli and definitely everyone in the shadow of Miyazaki, but also everybody sort of working their own angle too. I guess that was what struck me. And so I said, how does director Miyazaki feel about all the merchandising? And Suzuki says, well, of course, he doesn't want any merchandise. He says, he just cares about the art. That's all he really cares about. But he sort of gives this little wink. He's like, but we need to make money. So we're going to need to do them. I tell him we're going to need to do the merchandise. That's it. And he told the story of Howl's Moving Castle and how it was a very Japanese way that Hayao designed it, in that it was clearly built sort of piece by piece. He said that's the way Japanese houses are built. You build one part, then you build another one on top of it. You don't really think it out. It just sort of builds out.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of Japanese essentialism there, but nevertheless, it was an interesting little story. But my question is, so I had this connection with him, and then when I was trying to do field work, I had his email. We knew each other. I contacted him. I said, I'd love to do some field work at Ghibli. And he's like, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Just contact this person. And so I contacted that person, who shall remain nameless, who wrote back and said, forget it. It's not going to happen. And besides, if we even let you in the door here, every word of your book would have to be approved by us, and we're not going to let you do anything. And so that was another question, is whether did you face any pressure to change anything in your book? No, you didn't.
That's a good question. I did, partly because of my feeling that they were closely guarding things. I stayed away. And just, that's one reason. I had one interview with Miyazaki. I would love to have had more, but I just felt like they did not want to share anything. And, I'm sure that someday there will be a book that will be much more of a tell-all about Ghibli, but it may not be for another 20 years. I felt like they were polite, and I actually did ask to interview Takahata at one point, and the spokesperson came back and said, "Why on earth would Takahata want to talk to you for a book about Miyazaki?" And I thought, ooh, a little bit of bad blood going on there. But yeah, so I really I did my best considering everything, but I totally resonate with that. And also just think about merchandising. I'm very I have mixed feelings. It was very clear that Suzuki wants to keep on making films, and how do you make films? You need money, right? And merchandise helps. But I was kind of impressed how early on they really were trying not to get into that. And for the new theme park also sort of worries me a little bit, because I mean that God, let it be a Disney.
You don't know what's going to happen, right? Exactly. It'll probably be, but who knows? It's the style of the day. Hey, we got questions coming in on chat. So let's start. I'll start out with the first one, then maybe Yuko, you could do the second one. So here's one I'm sure many people are wondering. For Susan, which Miyazaki movie resonates with you the strongest, and why? Thank you, Nikki Suzuki, for that question.
That's actually a harder question than you think, because there are several that resonate with me. I mean, Totoro is just a beautiful, poignant work of art that also makes me, think about my childhood. I was, although I was raised in Boston, we had a family farm in Western Massachusetts, and I love that sense of being, that feeling of children being outside. I totally get that. I'm also very, very fond of Kiki's Delivery Service, which again is a work that ought to be known better. It's a gem of a movie about a young girl, learning to survive in a big city. The interesting thing about her, she happens to be a witch. But it's a remarkably psychologically believable portrait. It's really, I'm still amazed that Miyazaki, and man in his 50s, I think at that point, could really get into the psyche of a young girl that well. And sometimes in my course on Miyazaki, people these days are saying, well, how can a male director, really have any legitimate right to create female characters? And I feel like I actually think he does a really good job. And again, I think it's partly because his mother, and also he had a lot of women who worked with him at Studio Ghibli. They're very important, and they certainly, some of them were, really absolute linchpins of the animation, So, but okay, finally, I will say my favorite movie is probably Spirited Away. I mean, I just come back to that all the time. I think right now I've just finished an article on it. It's my fourth, I think, article, book chapter on Spirited Away. There's so much there. I mean, it has everything. And as Miyazaki himself said, he basically opened up the lid of his brain and just let everything flow. And it's beautiful. It's surreal. I had a student do a paper on surrealism of Spirited Away. It's very much related. It's concerned with present day issues about children and parents, about the environment, and yet it has this absolutely otherworldly, unique quality that's just, I've never seen anything like it anywhere else.
So, yeah, fascinating.
You're up, Yuko. Good luck. The questions are flowing in here. The questions are flowing in.
So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to combine two questions in one. The first one is, Susan, if you had a chance to interview Miyazaki again, what would you ask him in person? And the other question was, when he agreed to meet with you, how did you feel? And and actually I'm going to add that to that and say, were you scared of him? Because there are a lot of people who are very scared of him.
With good reason. Yeah, no, I felt over the moon when I heard that he was winning. I don't think I've ever been so excited in my life. I mean, I'd met him twice before, once when I was writing a book on anime, and then another time at a Japan Foundation dinner where he was actually getting a medal from the Japan Foundation. He was very chatty and very pleasant both times. But this time, as I said, this was a much bigger deal. And he had someone with him to kind of steer him through things, which kind of made me more nervous, to be honest. And I also felt that he was in a different kind of space than I'd seen him before. I mean, as I said, he just closed down the studio a couple of months before. and there was a kind of little bit of melancholy to him. So, gosh, what would I love that question. What would I ask Miyazaki now? I, I think I would probably ask him, do you think, could you, if you were to make a future movie, would you deal at all with the pandemic? I mean, one of his big things is resilience and the resilience of children. And I think his movies are very important to see, especially in this year, this time, because they show children dealing with apocalyptic, catastrophic events and just getting through them. But I'd just be curious to see. I mean, it's very interesting. He did this film called Ponyo about a tsunami in 2006, and in 2013 we have the 311 incident, the tsunami then, and he really is a brilliant director of catastrophe and of apocalypse. And I think if anyone could do a really interesting take on the year of 2020, I think he could. So that's probably what I would ask him to do if in his free time, if he wouldn't mind doing yet another movie, it'd be great.
From Toby, thank you for this. Can you speak about the interplay between the realistic humans and the wildly inventive monsters and fantasy creatures? That's one question. And this might or might not be related, but Chieko asks, Miyazaki always says he's making movies for children. Do you agree with him?
Nice. Yeah. Okay. First question. Yeah, I think that's one reason why his work is so effective and why it stays, is the fact that he has highly credible humans who are, as I said, Kiki is a remarkably believable young girl. The children in Totoro are utterly blue. They're quite bratty sometimes. Chihiro in Spirited Away is this apathetic twerp, when she comes in, but then they have these encounters with the magical, the fantastic, the supernatural, and it brings out something in them. And by the way, that's not just Miyazaki. This is an old tradition that he probably gets partly from European children's literature, especially English children's literature. And if I had more time in my presentation, I was going to talk about that. He was heavily influenced by English children's literature, which if you think about the Narnia stories or Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, in which kind of regular people or regular hobbits go out and have these amazing adventures, it's really part of this worldview of the potential for amazing things happening out there, that you're just one inch away from it. If you only looked around at the right moment or heard the right sound or entered the right door, you would find it. I think that's really that interplay which makes it so particularly stunning. His supernatural creatures are very interesting. Most of them are from his head. They are not Spirited Away. There are some traditional folkloric creatures mixed in, but definitely a lot of them are absolutely Miyazaki's own imagination. I'm sure he had a great time drawing them, creating them. And of course, his greatest creation, I would say, among supernatural creatures is definitely Totoro. And that's, he had all kinds of inspirations for that. He actually likes this Japanese children's writer, Miyazawa Kenji, and he was very impressed by an illustration from a story of Miyazawa Kenji's of some kind of animal just kind of sitting, looking out sort of spacily. And that he brought that into the Totoro idea. But again, it's his own vision. But to go back to children's literature, to children, no, I don't think his movies are necessarily for children. I think Totoro, and for example, is a great movie for 5-year-olds. But I also think it's a great movie for 55-year-olds, because it makes you think about your own childhood, the kind of joys, and again, these sort of special, wondrous aspects that are really very powerful things that even at our age, we need to remember. Totoro also is about growing older and losing some of those childhood joys. And it's, in a way, it's a very mature, very thoughtful movie. Other films such as Princess Mononoke are probably not necessarily for children. There is a lot of violence in them, but there's also great, marvelous animation and beautiful scenes that are just would definitely take a child's mind and kind of take it up to the up to the sky. But absolutely, I think he really is for everybody. I'm amazed by how many people I get letters from people about the book, and they're from all ages. It's very, very kind of moving to read these letters and see the incredible variety of people who love his work.
Great. Yuko, you're up.
Yep, I'm up. I'm going to combine two questions again. To what degree did Disney help in propagating the Studio Ghibli films? And also, in terms of like outside experience, outside influence, him influencing the outside, how does he compare to other animators who popularized anime in the 80s? For example, like Akira. How does he differ, or how is he the same?
Wow. Okay, two good questions, kind of different from each other. Disney absolutely was a very important force behind popularizing Ghibli and Miyazaki in particular in America. Absolutely. They first worked together on Princess Mononoke, and actually it was Miramax Films that distributed that one because they decided it was not really a Disney sort of suitable Disney product. But they really did make an effort. I mean, there is some talk among anime fandom about, oh, Disney could have done more. But it's really, again, I keep going back to the fact this was a non-Western cultural product. This was Japanese. And the fact that they did as much as they did is something that, we should remember and be grateful for. I think it was a fruitful partnership, particularly when it came to Spirited Away, which, as the Consul General mentioned, won an Academy Award. And I don't think that could have happened without the help of Disney, Disney sort of marketing, Disney's support, and also the people at Pixar, which is now part of the Disney kind of family as well. So yeah, I think Disney was very important. Now for the second question, sorry, what was that again? It was, sorry, do you mind?
How does he compare?
Akira and things like that. Yeah, the first anime movie I ever saw was in 1989 in London, and that was Akira, and it blew me away. I had never seen anything so unique and amazing. Just the animation was extraordinary. And clearly adult, by the way. And then the second animated movie I ever saw was Nausicaa. And that also blew me away. It's in some ways a gentler movie, although there's definitely violence in there. But it's, again, the imagery, the animation was so extraordinary. And back to this earlier question about sort of human characters, Nausicaa, the eponymous protagonist, is a young woman who is she has these special powers that she can communicate with non-human creatures, but she's also a very believable human being. And I was very impressed that this was a young woman, that we have a young woman hero. This is long before Katniss Everdeen and the Hunger Games. Here's a woman who's a warrior, who's also really smart. She's a scientist. She knows how to fly using this little kind of airplane called a Maeve. She's an explorer. I mean, this was amazing. So I think Akira and Nausicaa are very different films, but they both have incredibly quality animation. They have adult themes. Oh, and they're both apocalyptic, both very strongly apocalyptic. As I said, Nausicaa is really about a world that has been profoundly changed, probably permanently, by various industrial and scientific experiments that have gone wrong. Akira is all about the moment when these experiments go wrong, and they're both, again, very, very deep subjects. If you're used to, the animation of say Disney, or I grew up partly on things like the Flintstones or something. I mean, pretty mild, cutesy stuff. This was a very powerful wake-up call, and I realized that these films were just terribly exciting and really deserved to be studied.
And unfortunately, we only have one last question, and I think it is very wonderful that goes to Ian asking it.
I had a whole list of them here. I had a whole list. I'm going to put them all in one question here, and you can decide how you want to answer it. So the questions revolve around, what is the source of Miyazaki's genius? Ariana says, what is it that allows him to write such poignant stories with such importance? Some people wonder about his family relationship. Did you talk to Goro Miyazaki? What was his attitude of dad? Miles is wondering, wow, we got a new Ghibli animation here that's 3D. Is this, how should we think about this in terms of its 2D origins, spectacular 2D origins? And then Peter asks or suggested something about the Ampo generation, and that would be interesting. He would like to hear more about that. We're not going to have much time, but it's a great question to think about how much that relates and how that might really provide a different view compared to artists today. And then Magdalena was wondering about future projects, whether you have other creators you'd like to explore in a similar way. All right, so that's more a bunch of the questions out there. If there's anything in there you'd like to make as your final comment, it's up to you.
Just to explain Anpo, because someone's written on the chat, that's the period of early 1960s when you have these huge demonstrations about the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And it is interesting just to sort of talk about generations and artistic creativity. One of the things that Miyazaki gets very annoyed with is how the younger generation of animators do kind of are not really dealing with the real world. They don't go out and spend time looking at caterpillars. They are just, and they're going into 3D animation, and they're sort of getting away from the reality of the world, which is one of his huge impetuses, his huge inspirations. So I would say that is one of his main source of creativity, is his willingness to deal with the real world and process that into art.
Great.
That's enough for now. Yes.
And
it's 7 o'clock.
Fantastic. I'm sure our audience are saying, we want more, but I think that's when we always have to end, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Susan Napier and Ian.
My pleasure. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you, Yuko, and thanks everybody too.
My stuff.
But I did want to extend a big thank you, because this is, I always say, we do this for our audience, and this is not possible without you all. So thank you for coming. Thank you again, Ian. Thank you again, Susan. This was just a phenomenal evening.